In episode 33, titled Cloud Enumeration Concepts, we're going to frame cloud discovery the way it actually works in modern environments, as identities, services, and exposure, rather than as a hunt for servers. Pen test plus cloud questions often test whether you can reason about managed services, permission boundaries, and configuration-driven exposure without assuming an on-prem mindset. In the cloud, many of the most impactful failures are not about a missing patch. They are about who can do what is publicly reachable, and what logs exist to detect and respond. Enumeration in this context is the phase where you build a reliable picture of those elements using evidence, not assumptions, and then choose safe next steps that respect scope and shared responsibility constraints. The goal here is to give you a practical map of what to enumerate and how to talk about it without spilling sensitive details. By the end, you should be able to describe a cloud environment in a structured way that naturally leads to validation and remediation recommendations. Cloud resources should be understood as managed services, meaning the underlying infrastructure is often abstracted away, and shared responsibility realities shape what the organization controls and what the provider controls. This matters because enumeration is not just what is running, but what service is used, what configuration is chosen, and what responsibility boundary applies. A managed database, a storage service, or an identity platform is a service surface with its own configuration and access model, and the risk often lives in how it is configured and governed. Pen Test Plus questions use this to test whether you can identify the right focus, because enumerating operating system details may be irrelevant when the real issue is a policy or exposure setting. Shared responsibility also influences remediation, because some fixes are about changing your configuration and governance rather than expecting the provider to patch something for you. In exam scenarios, the right answer often reflects this by recommending changes to access policies, network allowances, or logging settings instead of patch the server. When you view cloud as managed services with shared boundaries, you enumerate the parts the organization actually controls. Identity surfaces are the core of cloud enumeration because cloud environments often run on the premise that identity is the perimeter. Roles, policies, keys, and trust relationships define what actions are possible and what pathways exist for an attacker or tester within scope. Roles describe sets of privileges. Policies define what is allowed. Keys represent the credentials that can act as identities. And trust relationships define who can assume what and under what conditions. Pen Test Plus scenarios often hint at identity issues through phrases like overly permissive role, service account access, or unexpected ability to list resources, and those are identity enumeration cues. The important point is that identity mistakes can create broad blast radius because a single overprivileged identity can reach many services and data stores. Enumeration here means understanding what identities exist, what permissions they carry, and what boundaries are supposed to limit them. When you treat identity as the primary surface, you naturally prioritize the most consequential paths first. Storage exposure patterns are another high-impact cloud enumeration area, and they often come down to public access, sharing links, and mispermissions rather than to traditional vulnerabilities. Public access means data can be reached without the expected identity boundary, which can create immediate harm even when the rest of the environment is well controlled. Sharing links can introduce access pathways that bypass normal governance if they are not managed carefully or if they persist longer than intended. Mispermissions can grant broader access than expected, such as allowing identities to read or write where they should not, which can lead to data exposure or integrity loss. Pen Test Plus prompts may describe an exposed bucket, unexpected file listing behavior, or a storage endpoint visible from the internet, and the test is whether you treat that as an exposure to validate safely. The key is to separate "the storage service exists" from "the storage service is publicly reachable," because the first is normal and the second is often a finding. When you enumerate storage exposure patterns, you are mapping the highest consequence surfaces without needing to touch compute at all. Service endpoints include management consoles, APIs, and exposed dashboards, and enumeration means identifying what is reachable and what interfaces exist for control and data access. Management consoles represent administrative surfaces where misconfiguration or weak identity enforcement can have high impact, and they are often protected but still part of the external posture. APIs represent programmatic control planes and data surfaces, and their exposure and authorization consistency matter greatly, especially when third-party integrations exist. Exposed dashboards and service interfaces can create direct visibility into operations, which can be sensitive even without direct data extraction, and the exam often frames these as unexpected public console or exposed monitoring endpoint type clues. The professional enumeration question is which endpoints exist, how they are accessed, and whether they are exposed beyond intended audiences. This is also where you watch for vendor patterns and hosted surfaces that may be governed by additional terms and constraints. When you map endpoints as interfaces, you can choose next steps that confirm exposure without escalating risk unnecessarily. Logging and monitoring clues are part of enumeration because they tell you whether the environment can detect and respond, not just whether it is vulnerable. A cloud environment with strong logging provides evidence and accountability, while one with missing logs creates blind spots that increase risk even if controls are otherwise reasonable. Pen Test Plus scenarios often include hints like "no audit logs enabled," "limited monitoring," or "alerts not configured," and those are signals that detection maturity may be part of the risk story. Enumeration here is about understanding what telemetry exists, what is missing, and what that implies for incident response and validation confidence. Missing logs can also change how you validate findings, because you may need to be extra cautious in environments where evidence trails are weak. This area also supports better remediation recommendations because enabling logging and alerting can be a high-leverage control that reduces risk quickly. When you include logging in your enumeration map, you think like a defender-aware tester, which is exactly what many exam questions reward. Configuration discovery in cloud contexts often centers on networks, security groups, and default allowances, because these settings define exposure and segmentation behavior. Network configuration determines what can talk to what, which services are reachable from the internet, and how internal segmentation is enforced. Security groups and similar control constructs define allowed inbound and outbound patterns, and misconfigurations there often create broader exposure than intended. Default allowances matter because cloud environments often start permissive and rely on deliberate tightening, and many real-world exposures come from leaving defaults in place or applying them inconsistently. The exam frequently tests whether you understand that open to the internet is often a configuration choice, not an unavoidable condition, and that tightening exposure is a primary remediation path. Enumeration here means identifying the presence of permissive rules, the role those rules play in service exposure, and the constraints that might have led to them. When you map configuration carefully, you can connect exposure findings to practical fixes that reduce risk without dramatic changes. A major pitfall is confusing tenant boundaries or assuming on-prem style controls apply the same way, because cloud environments introduce multi-tenant realities and abstracted control layers. Tenant boundary confusion can lead to wrong assumptions about what the organization controls, what is shared, and what is even in scope under an engagement. Assuming on-prem controls can lead to recommendations that do not fit, such as focusing on host hardening when the real issue is identity policy or a service-level configuration. Another pitfall is treating cloud resources as static, when in reality they are often dynamic and governed by automation, meaning your evidence must be timestamped and your conclusions must acknowledge change. Pen Test Plus questions often include subtle hints about shared responsibility and managed services to see whether you adjust your mindset. The professional approach is to keep focus on identities, exposures, and configuration state as observed, rather than on imagined server internals. When you avoid these pitfalls, your conclusions become more accurate and your recommendations become more implementable. Now imagine a scenario where a public bucket appears, because this is one of the most common cloud exposure patterns tested in certification questions. You observe that a storage location appears reachable without the expected identity boundary, suggesting public access or overly broad sharing. The safest next step is to plan controlled validation that confirms exposure exists and identifies what kind of access is possible, while minimizing data handling and avoiding unnecessary collection. You document what you observed and why it suggests exposure, and you consider escalation if the data appears sensitive or if the exposure could create immediate harm. You do not treat the existence of public access as permission to browse widely, because evidence handling principles still apply, and the goal is to prove the risk with minimal exposure. You also map what identity and configuration settings likely govern the exposure, because remediation will involve tightening permissions and changing access policies, not just removing files. This scenario tests whether you can be urgent and careful at the same time, which is a core exam skill. Quick wins in cloud enumeration often comes from prioritizing identity overreach and public data exposure first, because these issues have high blast radius and can be remediated quickly when handled properly. Identity overreach means roles or policies allow more than intended, which can enable lateral access across services and make many other controls irrelevant. Public data exposure means sensitive content is reachable without proper authorization, which is often high impact and time-sensitive. These areas also align with the shared responsibility model because they are usually within the organization's control to configure and govern. The exam tends to reward this prioritization because it reflects practical risk reduction, tighten who can act, and reduce what is publicly reachable. Quick wins also include improving logging and monitoring when it is missing, because that increases the organization's ability to detect misuse and validate that fixes work. When you prioritize these areas, your enumeration map becomes immediately actionable. Documenting cloud findings requires extra care because resource names and identifiers can be sensitive and can become a new leak if copied into a widely shared report. A professional approach describes findings in a way that is precise enough for remediation while avoiding unnecessary exposure of full resource names, access keys, or direct access paths. You can describe the resource type, the nature of exposure, the observed access behavior, and the likely control category involved, such as identity policy or storage permissions, without publishing sensitive identifiers. Confidence labeling is also important because cloud environments change, so you should distinguish confirmed behaviors from inferred configuration causes, and you should note the observation time context. Documentation should also reflect minimum necessary data handling, stating that evidence was collected carefully and redacted appropriately. Pen Test Plus questions around reporting often test whether you remember this discipline, because handling evidence poorly in cloud contexts can create more risk than it reduces. When you document carefully, you preserve both utility and safety. Enumeration should feed later actions by creating a structured map that guides validation, proof of impact, and remediation recommendations without skipping phases. The identity map tells you what permissions exist and where trust relationships might allow expansion, which guides targeted validation of access boundaries. The storage and endpoint map tells you what is exposed and how it is reached, which guides controlled confirmation steps and impact assessment within scope. The logging and configuration map tells you what evidence trails exist and what controls shape exposure, which guides both safe testing choices and remediation sequencing. The goal is to move from enumeration to validation and, when appropriate, to controlled proof, always staying aligned with objectives and constraints. Recommendations then follow naturally, such as tightening identity policies, removing public access, hardening security group rules, and enabling logging where it is missing. On the exam, the best answers often reflect this structured progression rather than jumping to an aggressive action. When enumeration feeds actions cleanly, your workflow reads as professional and defensible. A memory anchor can keep the cloud map organized, and a useful one is identity, storage, endpoints, logs, config. Identity reminds you to start with roles, policies, keys, and trust relationships because they define what actions are possible. Storage reminds you to look for public access, sharing patterns, and mispermissions because data exposure is often the highest impact. Endpoints reminds you to map management consoles, APIs, and dashboards that represent control and data surfaces. Logs reminds you to assess what monitoring exists and what is missing, because detection affects both risk and response. Config reminds you to examine network rules and default allowances that shape exposure and segmentation. This anchor is simple, but it covers the core surfaces Pentest Plus expects you to understand in cloud scenarios. If you can run it quickly, you can interpret most cloud prompts with confidence. In this episode, the main idea is that cloud enumeration is a structured map of identity, service exposure, storage permissions, endpoints, logging maturity, and configuration boundaries under shared responsibility realities. Managed services and tenant boundaries mean you focus on what the organization configures and governs, especially roles, policies, trust relationships, and network allowances. Storage exposure patterns and public endpoints are high-impact surfaces that require careful, minimal evidence handling, and logging clues reveal whether the environment can detect and respond effectively. Avoid pitfalls like assuming on-prem style controls apply directly, or confusing ownership and tenant boundaries, and document findings without leaking sensitive resource identifiers. Use the identity, storage, endpoints, logs, config anchor to keep your thinking organized. Then narrate one safe next step, such as confirming a suspected public exposure with minimal data handling and prompt escalation when sensitivity is implied. When you can do that calmly, cloud scenarios become a matter of structured reasoning rather than uncertainty about unfamiliar services. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.